On this week's 51%, we speak with comedian and writer Jena Friedman about her new book, Not Funny, reflecting on her experience as a woman in comedy and her personal brand of funny.
Comedy that makes people uncomfortable, but also that you kind of know is, I don't want to say bulletproof, because I don't think our society needs any more gun analogies, but a joke that you know really works and that pushes people's buttons in all the right ways. That to me is like a perfect joke.
I'm Jessie King. It's all up next on 51%.
I was standing around like one of those girls I had seen in a movie. The whole world was a movie back then. I had my sunglasses on, I wanted to be seen without seeing shy Lolita. I wasn't really in it, I didn't really get it.
You're listening to 51%, a WAMC production dedicated to women's issues and experiences. Thanks for joining us. I'm Jessie King. The past few weeks of this show have been pretty heavy. We've learned about medication abortions and examined attempts to restrict mifepristone nationwide. We've talked about sexual assault, femicide, and protests decrying violence against women all over the globe. All very important subjects, I should say. That's what we're here to talk about. But it's grim. I thought maybe we should take a bit of a breather this week, relax, and I guess talk some comedy. As it happens, though, our first guest's new book is actually called Not Funny: Essays on Life, Comedy, Culture, etc. Comedian, filmmaker, and TV host Jena Friedman has written for productions like The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Late Show with David Letterman, The Connors, and even Borat, too. Her latest comedy special from Peacock is called Lady Killer, and through all of these things, her witty sarcasm and deadpan delivery shines through. Friedman says she likes to take audiences to the edge of uncomfortable, and Not Funny is no exception. In many ways, she uses the essays to reflect on her career and all the unfunny things comedy makes easier to talk about, from politics to misogyny. Before we start, a tiny content warning for today's episode. Friedman herself is not afraid to joke about abortion and miscarriages. If that's something that's going to make you too uncomfortable, I'm letting you know now. I should also point out that this conversation was recorded before thousands of TV and film writers with the Writers Guild of America went on strike. Friedman is among them, but she doesn't address it here. What she does talk about is how one tweet in the midst of the pandemic led to a book's worth of introspection and analysis into her career, her personal life, and comedy overall.
I had a lit agent approach me after a tweet that I wrote kind of went viral. It was a satirical tweet about people speaking at the RNC. Specifically, I'd seen that the McCloskeys, that couple who pointed guns at protesters, were speaking at the RNC. So I wrote something to the effect of Brock Turner speaking at the RNC. Then I also wrote like breaking news, Bat who gave world COVID speaking at the RNC. But the Brock Turner tweet, people I think thought it was real and it went viral. Someone had interviewed a Stanford professor who was like, that's not funny. And then I think Newsweek picked it up and they were like, the viral, like, and so it became less about the fact that the news wasn't real and more about how like this comedian wasn't funny who tweeted this. When I think the fact that it went viral and that people thought it was real spoke volumes about the Republican Party at that time, as if they're any different now. But afterwards, a lit agent had reached out and they were like, we think you could probably sell a book at this moment off something like this. It sounds so messed up that I wrote a book off the heels of a tweet that was inoffensive and weird on a lot of levels. But I think we're just in this kind of insane cultural moment. And I had the time and interest. And so I pitched the book, and then the book ended up being a little different than what I had pitched. And it just kind of evolved into a series of essays about my 15 years in comedy.
How did you get into comedy? You write anyway that you have a very unfunny way of approaching it.
Yeah, I mean, I got into comedy by writing a paper in college about it, which is so not funny. And so I think just approaching comedy from an analytical perspective, which also is unfunny, was a kind of interesting way to set the book up, because that's really how it happened. And I've always been very conscious of politics around jokes. And I think as anyone who's slightly on the margins, so just anyone who's not your like typical comedian, anything you do is inherently political. And so when you are actually just trying to be funny, it can kind of be an impediment to that. But that's been pretty much my whole path, doing political comedy and trying to be funny while at the same time hold a set of principles, and then learning kind of where the line is and crossing the line and figuring out how to find my voice in this current moment, and all those kinds of things I touch on in the book.
I guess let's just jump right into it. You have an essay that's dedicated to what you call dead baby jokes, from like the very absurd, shocking kind that you usually hear from younger people to what you call adult dead baby jokes that are about like miscarriage, abortion, basically anything about the female experience that makes people uncomfortable, but for women can make those things easier to deal with. You argue that it can be a political tool, but these jokes are so taboo that they're also just like a comedic bomb. One thing that stuck with me is like at one point you talk about how you pitched a period joke while working for a late night with David Letterman, and you were told to never do so again, that pitching another joke like that could be a fireable offense. And that was, I guess, just mind-boggling to me. I mean, like I can get why an abortion joke would be divisive, but periods? But I guess when you think about it, like I can't remember the last time I heard a period joke on a late night show either.
Yeah, well, that was 2011. And I think if you were to talk to Dave now, I mean, and it also didn't come from Dave. It came from his head writers who were anticipating what he liked and what he didn't like. And I think at the time, I don't know if at the time it was like this like 25 or 30-year history of the show, he'd only had 7 women writers, even though one of the original co-writers and creators of the show is Meryl Marco, who is brilliant. So the origins of the show had, female DNA in them. But yeah, I mean, I think at that time that's just what the climate was like. There weren't a ton of women working in late night. It was always interesting to me that the feedback was, oh, our audience went like this, our audience. But when you actually looked at the statistics, I think the late night audiences at the time were like over 50% female. So it was like this mythological audience of, some like white guy back in the day. I don't know who they were thinking of when they were thinking of our audience, but a lot of late night hosts, male and female, I'm laughing as I say female, but a lot of late night hosts, I think, have a similar skittish attitude towards like women's healthcare being topics that they can mine comedy from. My feelings about it are, if they're legislating things, we need to be talking about it and keeping the stuff in the zeitgeist because it's happening. And the more we talk about, the more we can like normalize it and understand it and make it less taboo and hopefully have conversations about these things. Like miscarriage is one thing that I think no one wants to talk about, but yet it's so common. And now, in certain states, if you miscarry, you could be accused of infanticide in some states that have really strong pro-life laws. So I think it's critical for us to talk about these things because they're affecting people whether we talk about them or not. But yeah, it was interesting. And every host that you write for has their different likes and dislikes, and you just kind of have to, part of writing for someone else and getting paid to write for someone else is to anticipate what those are.
Another essay that really stuck with me was your essay on likability and how hard it is to achieve and keep. You write that there's like a lot of pressure as a woman in comedy to deliver maybe what people are expecting from you or I guess hoping to hear from you. And I think that's something that we can all resonate with, women and men, even beyond comedy.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that was my experience definitely in my 20s and in entertainment, when so much is out of your control. And I remember my first comedy manager, and I wrote about this, saying that likability is the thing that makes people either famous or not famous. If you're likable, like you'll be successful. And like, what does likability mean? And what does it mean for different people? And it's so subjective. And it's such a reflection of our culture and what we value. And it changes over time. I just always bumped up against like, oh, I have to be this way for people to like me. And not just like me, but in order for me to survive economically. And I think that that's like a really important through line of the book when we talk about the experience of female comedians and how we have to bend, not just to fit what other people want us to be, but to make money. And yes, to your point, it's that way in every industry. In every industry, you have to, I think, act a certain way for, to get a raise, to get promoted, to get tips in the service industries specifically. And how does likability factor in, again, as a woman, as a young woman, as there's just so much to think about when we think about these kind of abstract concepts.
In your experience, what did likability usually entail as a female comedian?
I think softening your edges. Even when you do a late night set, I did a late night set a couple years ago and I was in all black. And then after I watched it, I'm like, I should have worn like a pastel shirt to make me more likable or more approachable. But yeah, I would say for me personally, it involved probably softening the edges. I talk about an anecdote about a comedy booker kind of chastising women for wearing heels on stage, whatever that meant. Just trying to make the physical features, your physical aspects like muted, and just to look whatever that like basic look is so that the audience would judge you less harshly for whatever that. I mean, it's so hard to articulate, which is why I wrote an essay on it. You think you have it right, and then you can never really get it right. It's like that white whale. It's just like this thing that you're kind of chasing. Like, how do I become more authentic? Or like it's chasing authenticity inauthentic. You know, it's like head spinning. And it's the last thing you want to think about when you're trying to create anything or just, focus on the work. Because so much about comedy isn't just the words you say or the jokes you write. It's all these other things.
Is that something that at this point in your career you still feel like you have to navigate? Or do you feel a little more established now and willing to say and do whatever you want?
I definitely do say and do whatever I want. How effective that is to be determined. Still, I mean, I'm not a known quantity. So when I go on stage, if I do a late night set or something, I do have to think about how to dress or how to be, because people don't know who I am, and which is good. I mean, I think there's a lot of power in that as well. It's definitely a lot easier than it was, but it's still, and I think for any, public figure, particularly a woman, I mean, you can look at any female politician or the wives of politicians, how they have to dress, how they have to look, how they have to act, even once people know them, it's not something you can ignore.
What makes the perfect joke to you? Not to kill a joke by asking you to analyze it, but like, what kind of comedy do you usually go for? What's your inspiration?
I mean, I always go for what's funny to me, whether or not it's funny to other people. You figure it out. You do open mics or you do shows where you test out material. My favorite shows are shows where I can bring a joke book or my phone on stage and kind of test out material and see what people find funny and what they don't. And I think the perfect joke is usually a combination of what you're excited about, but also something that resonates with your audience. And it's tricky because different audiences have different reactions to things. So I know that if I do a show in a certain club, that audience just might not get the material that I find exciting. And sometimes I'm okay with that. And if you do a joke enough times in enough places, you kind of get a sense of what you can get away with and what you can't. For example, to go back to the miscarriage joke, I had this joke that I really believed in. It was at a time when a lot of my friends were having miscarriages. They were really upset about it, but it was also because they didn't realize like how common of an experience it is. And I think when you realize how common it is, it makes it, I mean, it's still heartbreaking for a lot of people, but it just makes it less so because you realize you're not alone and that it's also part of the process of having a kid is having miscarriages, whatever. I wrote this joke and I felt like this is a good joke. It's funny. It's dark. It's also a thing that's happening. So I feel like I can talk about it. It was working in all these crowds until I was visibly pregnant. The minute I was visibly pregnant, that joke just took on a completely different reaction from the audience. But at the same time, because it had worked for like over a year, in all sorts of rooms when I wasn't visibly pregnant, I had total confidence in the joke itself. And then it became really fun to tell in audiences where people didn't laugh because I just had confidence that the joke worked and they weren't laughing because I was pregnant. And then you can play with that too. And I think that to me was like the sweet spot of like, oh, here's a joke that really makes people uncomfortable. And I know that their discomfort is because I'm pregnant, not because the joke is bad. And then that kind of became part of the joke. Like, you have to laugh at that. Otherwise, you'll stress out the pregnant lady, So it was really, that's my favorite type of comedy to do, comedy that makes people uncomfortable, but also that you kind of know is, I don't want to say bulletproof because I don't think our society needs any more gun analogies, but a joke that really works and that kind of pushes people's buttons in all the right ways. That to me is like a perfect joke.
There's been a lot of talk about cancel culture in comedy and holding bad actors accountable. I mean, a number of comedians were named in the height of the Me Too movement, and there's always been debate about how people should respond to offensive jokes. But I'm curious what your thoughts are on it all. What do you see as the biggest issues in comedy right now?
I mean, I think a lot of these issues are going on everywhere. People are just interested in comedy. They're interested in entertainment. So they're watching our industry, but the same things are happening everywhere. The two things which I think we really need to distinguish, one is just quote unquote cancel culture, which I do write about in the book. I mean, that I think is a nebulous term that everyone's talking about. And I wrote a whole essay about it that I'm like, it's so exhausting. I don't even want to get into. But then the other thing I think that's really important is like workplace misconduct and just sexual harassment and assault and misconduct in general. I think that, you know, now that people have platforms and are being listened to, we're unearthing a lot more of it and realizing how common it is. And I think that that's a good thing. And I think it's good for people to be held accountable for things that are illegal. And oftentimes they're not. You know, Bill Cosby is planning his next tour. So, you know, at least we're talking about this stuff, but I don't think people are being held accountable to the level that they should be for doing things that are actually illegal and horrible. But yeah, that's our whole culture. I mean, I do think social media, for better or for worse, has given voice to a lot of people who didn't have a voice before. And the positive side is that we're hearing a lot more about how power is being misused than we ever have before. I don't think we have the right frameworks in place to punish those people. And on the other side, to also help those people heal and, you know, have a path towards, I don't know what the word is. I don't know, like, if the word is like a path towards, like, you know, being uncanceled, because at the end of the day, they're not being canceled. But yeah, I think like the mob rule mentality is very dangerous. And we've seen that it's very dangerous, but also the underlying root of it is so much more insidious and so much more dangerous, which is that people are doing really things and they're not being held accountable.
I also wanted to pick your brain a bit about the intersection of comedy and news. A lot of your comedy is political, and you've done work on shows like The Daily Show. When I was growing up as a young person, that's where a lot of my friends were actually getting their news, through jokes and social media. And at least from my perspective, I mean, I'm younger, so this might not be anything new, but I feel like it's exploded over the past couple decades at least. Now you've got political jokes that just dominate late night monologues even. I was wondering what your take is on it. Does that increase the pressure at all, knowing that there are people who may be getting their information through comedy segments?
A lot of us grew up with The Daily Show being our trusted news source, and having actually worked at The Daily Show and been part of how that sausage is made, it should be trusted. I mean, the level of journalism that we used while we were covering stories was as good, if not better, than any other mainstream media outlet. I mean, I remember we did a piece on the fast food worker strikes, and McDonald's was one of our sponsors, and John didn't care, and we were never censored, and we were allowed to say exactly what we wanted to say. And so I do think that, and I don't want to say all comedians, because I don't want to speak about comedians as like a monolith, but comedians such as Jon Stewart, Hassan Minhaj, John Oliver, Sam B. I think the level of integrity, Stephen Colbert, in the work that they do is trustworthy. And I think we're in a moment where, you know, a lot of the mainstream outlets have lost credibility because, you know, they are beholden to maybe special interest groups or for whatever reason. So I do think certain comedic outlets have earned trust. And there's something about comedy that, you know, it like sugarcoats really hard things to talk about, and it taps into like our shared experience. And so, and again, I don't want to, like, you know, Joe Rogan's a comedian too, and I don't think that his podcast is really helping us out. But, you know, I remember when John announced that he was stepping down from The Daily Show, I was working on a piece with Jordan Klepper. He was a correspondent, and the piece was on gun laws in Florida. There was like a gag order on physicians, on pediatricians who wanted to tell parents how to safely lock up their guns. They weren't allowed to because the state put a gag order on them. Which this is like the reality that we're in. It's almost like truth is stranger than fiction, and you can't make this stuff up. Mm-hmm. And I remember we were talking to a Second Amendment attorney, and he was sad when he heard John was stepping down. And this is a guy with completely opposing political views to John, but because he found John funny, he was still able to appreciate what John did. And I think that's also a really powerful thing about comedy. You can actually more easily reach across the aisle with it because you're coming from a place of like joy and laughter and trying to and connection. I love that. And then I also think in this current moment, like, John left before Trump became president. Like right now, the reality and the news is so insane. Like I'm obsessed with George Santos. I can't believe he's a real person in office, and I can't believe he's not like a bit that I came up. Like I'm jealous that like I didn't make that up, because I just can't believe a guy like that who's like a known liar is still in office. And so part of me thinks like the only way to actually understand these things is with like a comedic lens, but a comedic lens like, one hopefully with integrity, where we at the Daily Show we had really good researchers and fact checkers, and it's earned is my point. I think the trust is earned.
Well, lastly, Jena, are there any chapters or essays that you particularly like to highlight, or that were cathartic or enjoyable for you to revisit and write?
I definitely think the likability essay was cathartic. I would say cathartic. The American Girl essay was also pretty cathartic, because that was, I've been doing this for 15 years and I have all these projects and things and experiences that I've done. And I just remember for anyone listening who hasn't read it, the gist of that is I wrote a parody of American Girl dolls that got critically panned in Chicago. And then we tweaked the ending and it got really well reviewed in New York, same publication, Time Out, which on a funny side note, Time Out would not let us publish the actual reviews. We had to publish condensed versions of them. But talking about that story and how it connects to me and how it taught me about, what makes effective satire, that was very cathartic to put that on paper for other people, because it was just an experience that has really affected me that I just had never written about.
Jena Friedman is a stand-up comedian, writer, filmmaker, and TV host whose work has been featured on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, The Late Show with David Letterman, Indefensible, and Soft Focus with Jena Friedman on Adult Swim. Her new essay collection reflecting on her career is called Not Funny, Essays on Life, Comedy, Culture, etc. Out now through One Signal Publishers. Jena, thanks for stopping in.
Of course.
Our next guest called me while she was mid-tour, preparing to record her next special later this year. Actress and comedian Rachel Feinstein has years of stand-up under her belt and has appeared alongside her friend Amy Schumer on hit shows like Life and Beth and Inside Amy Schumer. She's also a frequent guest on the late-night circuit, has multiple Comedy Central specials, and was a finalist on NBC's Last Comic Standing back in 2010. Her new set has a lot of the blunt humor she's known for. Feinstein talks openly about sex, being married to a firefighter, being a mom to a 3-year-old daughter, and navigating the political differences between her parents and her in-laws. But she's also known for her impressions. Whether it's her father or a complete stranger, Feinstein has always had a knack for mimicry.
My mom thinks I got it from my dad, because my dad he's a blues musician, and he doesn't read music, but he sort of plays by ear. So I just kind of hear somebody and imitate them. I remember my mom explaining that I'm not supposed to do that to people in front of them, because I would just talk back to them in the same voice. Like my grandma would come over and be like, well, good morning. I'd be like, well, good morning. Then she explained to me that, no, you have to mock them behind their back. So that was an important early moral lesson. As a child, I learned that you can't mock people to their faces. I was like, no, you wait till they leave, and then you can make fun of them and attack their character.
Well, since you're getting ready for a new special, I thought I'd ask, just like, what's your creative process like? How do you workshop a set?
Really, you just I take it on the road. I go and perform it in all kinds of different situations and different towns. And sometimes the crowds are great. Sometimes there's like some drunk bachelorette party in the front row, or some lunatic, like loud lunatic that throws something at you. I've had somebody people have thrown snacks at me before, like chips, notes, like hateful notes, which is really funny to write somebody like a letter about how they're disgraceful. But I feel like the more I work something on the road in different environments, you just kind of cut the fat, figure out what lines work and what don't. and you listen to yourself. And I hate listening to myself. And I really, when I watch my own shows, want to close myself like a box. I'm just like, ugh, what did I ever need to say to anybody? Just shut up. For the love of God, shut up. But if you listen to yourself, you can get stronger because you just realize the stuff you don't need or the weird things you say too much. Whatever my own foul tendencies are, I'm able to kind of like, tighten things up by listening to my sets and just going on the road to any place, any dumb place they ask me to go. I just hurl my body there.
I can relate a lot to that feeling of just like hating listening back to your own voice. It doesn't make sense considering what I do, I guess, but you just kind of had to get over it because it really does help. Because sometimes I listen back to what I wrote and I'm like, okay, that sounded a lot better in my head than it actually does out loud. So it does help.
Also, in the comment section, they always remind me that I have a man voice. So if you're listening to this, you don't need to tell me that I have a man. I know that I sound like a husky truck driver or something. I'm not sure why, but people are always like, man voice, listen to her. But for some reason, I get just kind of real gruff and hardy when I'm on stage. I sort of walk to in a real hostile way and stomp a lot. My mom always told me that. She's like, you walk too loudly. You have a hostile step.
Hostile step. I don't think I've ever heard it described that way. I've heard of heavy step, but not hostile. I think that's a great word.
She always reminds me when I go home to visit my parents that my mom's always like, just try to walk softly because you have a very hostile step and your brother needs to nap. It's a weird life. I wish I'd known to just not internalize everything and not read the comments. Honestly, you can't read the comments. I mean, I was just telling my friend about this other comedian, Stavros, really funny guy. Like, I read the comments and you can't do that. You'll drive yourself insane. Some guy was like, your arms are fatter than last week. I'm like, someone's tracking my arm fat. Like, why don't I just stop right now and just end it all? You can't read that stuff because you'll drive yourself insane. Like, the positive's almost as bad as the negative because it'd just be like, either you're flawless or you're a gangrenous, flailing mess. But either way, like they're either too good or too devastating. And it's not going to give me any insight to read that stuff, but I filter through it. And I haven't learned to really stop until just recently.
This might be a little bit of a silly question. I mean, you've been doing stand-up for a while now, but do you ever still get nervous? Like, do you need to like pump yourself up before going on?
Sometimes, but it's really like quick. But I get more nervous if I know there's a comedian in the audience or a specific person. Like you could play for like 1,000 strangers. Like when I was on the road opening for Schumer or other people like that, I would maybe get nervous, but then it's like my dad's in the room and I'm like, oh, Howie's here. I can't talk about in front of Howie. And I do, and it's not comfortable. I remember having a show once where the host went up after me and he was like, she's a dirty birdie. And I was just thinking that they would never have said that to like Norton or Attell, but it was so dumb that it just made me laugh. It was ridiculous. But like, I talk about a lot of things, my family, all kinds of different aspects of my life, my husband, but people will really zone in on anything sexual that I do and kind of scold me. So it's kind of funny because if you can't, I mean, you have to laugh at it. What else can you do? I feel like it's much better also than it was when I started. I think we'll slowly get to a place where somebody brings me on stage, like, they don't need to be like, we got a young lady coming up, which doesn't happen all the time, but still occasionally I'll get that. Like it's a wacky experiment. We're not just this weird small percentage anymore. So it's definitely a lot better.
You said you pull a lot from your family and personal life. Is there anything that's particularly inspiring you or bugging you, I guess, right now?
I start from complaints usually. So it's just like some infuriating situation that I vent about on stage. So it could be like something my husband did that enraged me. He once boarded a plane without me and we weren't even fighting. He's just an idiot. I got on the plane. I'm like, what the f-? And he's like, I thought I'd get myself situated. And so I thought about that for a while. I think it still infuriates me too much that I can't even write about it. Usually it's like I'm angry, but I can't be so angry that I can't think. And that's when I can talk about it on stage. I mean, truthfully, we weren't even fighting. He's just so oblivious. I mean, it's such an insane thing to do. I can't even begin to approach the madness of it. But usually, yeah, it'll start with something that pisses me off or something that I'm really embarrassed by, just like a freshly humiliating experience.
Well, lastly, I thought, for aspiring comedians, what's the best advice you've ever gotten? And what do you wish you had maybe known when you first started out?
I think really just getting up as much as you can and taping your own sets and listening to yourself is the best advice that I was given. And in the beginning, I think I know myself, I took like big wild swings and I was sort of trying everything out. And sometimes later on, you want to like veer away from what you're comfortable with and try different stuff. But in the beginning, really trying a joke until it works and not kind of bailing on it is helpful to me, because like jokes have this weird like pubescent awkward stage before they get laughs, and you have to be able to sit in that strange space and work it on stage. Often for me, when I do something on stage, I'll find a punchline in desperation. I'll find like the right word choice or whatever. I'm out there flailing around and I accidentally stumble on, the right line. But a lot of times jokes that I want to bail on because they're not working right away end up being like maybe a closer or like a place that is like maybe a new favorite part of my act, but they usually start out bombing. So you just have to like walk through something until it works. And then if you do it for a while and it's just never gets a laugh, then you have to also be able to shed it too. But kind of, listening to yourself and figuring out those little things. Because sometimes it's as simple as just switching out a word or realizing somebody doesn't know what you mean when you say that. You have to use, just like when you're traveling and they say lift here, not elevator. The joke's going to work better if I say lift. Even if they know what an elevator is, it's just going to get a quicker laugh because they won't have to think about it for a second. So there's just certain things like that. And you can only kind of figure that out when you make yourself listen to your weird man voice.
Actress and comedian Rachel Feinstein is currently on tour in the U.S. as she gets ready to record a special later this year. You can find dates and tickets at her website, rachel-feinstein.com. Thanks for coming on, Rachel.
Thank you. Thank you for talking to me.
Thanks to you for listening to this week's 51%. 51% is a national production of WAMC Northeast Public Radio in Albany, New York. It's produced and hosted by me, Jesse King, with help from our associate producer, Jody Cowan. Our executive producer is Dr. Alan Chartock, and our theme is Lolita by the Albany-based artist Girl Blue. Just a reminder that you can listen to 51% anytime at WAMCpodcasts.org or wherever you get your podcasts. On social media, we're at WAMC Radio, and you can stay in the loop by signing up for our weekly newsletter, Airwaves, at WAMC.org. We hope you'll join us next week. Until then, I'm Jesse King for 51%.
I was every single girl, I was nobody else, I was so sure of myself. I was 15 and a half, he was a hollow laugh. And I lost my cool somewhere along the way. The nightmare down the hallway, I had to learn how to look away. I lost my cool, no electricity, hot rain on the concrete, sweet melting little girl dreams. They said